Hello, welcome to IndyStar's IndyCar Weekly, our IndyCar podcast with, of course, our Motorsports insider Nathan Brown. They're a fairly busy stretch here for IndyCar for any number of reasons. We will, of course, get into the controversy with Team Penske, and the push to pass. We will also get into the David Malukas being let go by Arrow McLaren. But we'll start with a quick recap on Barber. McLaughlin winning is obviously interesting given that he was involved in the controversy with Team Penske. But just what are your general thoughts on what was an exciting race when those races at Barber haven't always been exciting?
Yeah, it was, first of all, gosh, in the first 20 to 30 laps, I feel like we had two-thirds of the field either making some serious wheel-to-wheel contact. We had drivers going off on their own. We had drivers going off together. I bet if I went through and rewatched the race, we could probably find just about every single driver involved in something. And I don't know if there was anything that led to that in particular, but it led to a really exciting race. You had strategy, which is always a big thing at Barber, whether you go two stops and fuel save, whether you go three stops and really hammer through. And the way whichever one of those works just always comes down to yellow flags. We've seen it, each of the last several years. And we had a really interesting break through the field on who was running two stops, who was running three stops. And ultimately, a yellow flag for Stingray Robb losing his steering on lap 55 really kind of broke this for that three-stop contingent. You had guys on that two-stop strategy. Therefore, when we're under yellow between lap 55 and 60, they're having to run about 30 lap stints or so. And because you had a yellow flag there, they're basically forced to have to pit with just over 30 laps to go, meaning they're running a little bit longer stint that they want to, but you've got to stop because you got a caution flag. You don't want to pit under green if you don't have to. And that means those guys like Alex Palou, Felix Rosenquist, who looked, at some point in this race back and forth as if they might have a chance, Alex in particular, they end up getting caught kind of on the back foot. They've got a fuel save. They got to hope for another yellow flag to help them out to get to the end and maybe be able to run a little bit harder. And after we got through things, no impactful yellows until that one at the very last where we had a green flag with just a couple laps to go, and that didn't really make much of a difference for Alex Palou and company. They were already sitting back in that fourth, fifth, sixth range and didn't have enough at that point to be able to take it to Scott McLaughlin, Will Power, Linus Lundqvist. That is your podium for Barber. Just overall a really exciting race. I know it was overshadowed in a lot of ways by what had happened between Wednesday and Saturday, between Penske getting these penalties, series of driver statements and press conferences, Tim Cindric giving me an interview on Thursday, Roger Penske meeting privately with team owners on Saturday afternoon. But if you just look at this race, I know for whatever reason the TV rating didn't really show it again. Probably just over 800,000 average for the whole broadcast when you include streaming and NBCSports.com. But one of the better races I feel like I've ever watched in my time on the beat at Barber, and another exciting one after we had that break between Thermal and Long Beach. Long Beach was a great race. This was a great race, and at least on track action as that's concerned, some exciting momentum and exciting look at the field as we get into everything that May brings at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Do you think that the back-to-back exciting races is that just sort of random good luck or whatever you want to call it, or do you think that this is a sign of where the series is at in terms of having a little bit more of that at some of these tracks?
It was something I was definitely worried about coming into this weird, kind of stretch of the season that we had. St. Pete is typically a pretty solid race, and that was a bit of a snoozer with how much of a fuel save race it turned into. Then you've got Thermal, which is what it was. We don't need to rehash that again, but I think for a lot of folks kind of was a bit of a turnoff. And then when you've got a 4-week break and you go to Long Beach, oftentimes not a ton of passing, same thing at Barber. And yet you had these battles over the last 10, 15, 20 laps that were some of the better ones that we've seen, in terms of a true mano-a-mano battle for the win. And you had not just two drivers on the same strategy, and you were having to hope that someone was going to, barrel through a break zone and try to really shove a pass in there. You had dueling strategies on these 2 and 3 lap or 2 and 3 stop calls that these teams were making when they're rolling the dice and deciding which route to take 10 to 15 laps into this 90 lap race. I mean, I had myself writing my recap story. You were watching that advantage that Scott McLaughlin was building on Alex Palou. You were watching it jump up 2 to 3 seconds every single lap, and then wondering, okay, the pit lane delta is about 25 to 26 seconds. Scott's got a 22-second advantage. Now it's 24. Now it's 26. How are they going to come out of pit lane? I was expecting maybe a little bit more action right when McLaughlin came out of the pits for the final time. At that point, though, he'd already built, I think, a multi-second lead. So he came out of the pits, and Palou was still, I think, 4 or 5 seconds back. And at that point, it was Scott's race to lose. But I think it just comes down to, this is a really strong, deep field. It is amazing the fact that we have 27 cars in the grid, and I'd say easily 2/3 of them you could talk yourself into on a Saturday or Sunday when you're envisioning how this race could go. There's a situation where probably 2/3 of those cars could go and win the race, and on Sunday evening, you wouldn't be wildly surprised. And we are probably only 5, 6, 7 years removed from grids that were 18, 19, 20 full-time cars, and maybe half of those could win realistically without something really wacky happening. I think that's a testament in some ways to the strengths of this series. It's great and strong in some ways. It's got a long ways to go in some others, and it leads to an interesting argument on where this series' health really is. But from an on-track standpoint, even though you've got a 12-year-old car, and not a whole lot of change in this engine formula, although we'll get to that later this summer. It's been an exciting start to this year, given what the schedule was giving us when we got to St. Pete on March 10th.
And that's reflected in the standings right now. I think you said 6 different teams in the top 10. Just break that down for us.
Yeah, it's you've got, interestingly, through 3 races, Colton Herta leads us in points. He's got a 1-point lead over Will Power. Interesting that your top 2 guys in points actually don't have a race win this year through 3 points races. You've got 6 teams represented in that top 10. You've got Andretti, you've got Penske, you've got Ganassi, you've got McLaren. And then you've also got Meyershank Racing and AJ Foyt Racing. Again, just 3 races into a 17-race points-paying season. We've got a lot of races coming up here over the next couple months before we get to this Olympics break. I mean, starting with Long Beach, we had cars on track 7 of 8 weekends. We have an off weekend obviously coming up here, and then one of those includes Indy 500 qualifying. But this is a really pivotal stretch of which there is not going to be really a whole lot of a break after Road America. You've got at least one, if not multiple tests that teams will do between Road America and Laguna Seca. And then you've got another off weekend before Mid-Ohio. And then you have 4 races in 3 weekends before the Olympic break. And at that point, I think we'll have 12 of the 17 races out of the way. We'll really start to see this points race shape up. But at this point right now, you've got 2 drivers in Colton and Will that I feel like if you ask them and they were to speak honestly, maybe feel like they haven't even had as good of a season as maybe they would have wanted. I mean, without the penalties, Colton was a bit of a distant 5th at St. Pete. He obviously moves up to 3rd with Scott McLaughlin and Joseph Newgarden getting disqualified. So all of a sudden he's got 3rd place at St. Pete. I think he finished fourth in the non-points race at Thermal. He finishes second at Long Beach. And then even with, an eighth place finish at Barber, where he wasn't really very much in the picture, he overtakes Scott Dixon, who finished 15th on Sunday, and he moves into the points lead. Colton coming off a couple really, I would say, disappointing seasons. I think that's fair to say. He was right around 10th in the championship after it's not that long ago that we were talking about him being a hopeful talent on the F1 grid if Andretti had gotten a bid, and that talk fell fast over these last couple seasons. So if he could hold on to this form, the 500 has been a bit of a tough go for Andretti Global over these last couple of years. So interested to see how he can hold that down over these next couple of weeks. You got Will Power in second, as I mentioned, 1 point back of Colton. Third place, Alex Palou lurking 3 points back of Herta. Alex won this race on the IMS Road course here last year. Could make a very valid argument that he was the fastest car in last year's 500. It had not Rinus VeeKay run into him on pit lane about halfway through that race. So Alex is obviously a lurker, and would not be surprised to see him hoisting a third championship in 4 years. A couple months down the road, you've got Scott Dixon, who I mentioned was first leading or coming into Barber, fell back to fourth with a bit of a tough day, picked the wrong strategy, kind of just had a tough day all around. Fifth, Felix Rosenquist continuing to shine, one of the only four drivers so far this year, the others being Palou, Herta, Will Power, that have logged top 10 in all three of these races. I think, talking to Felix, talking to folks at Meyershank Racing, they've come away from some of these races, Long Beach being one of them, being a little frustrated that they were starting so close up front, and yet, they weren't on a podium, weren't contending for a race win. But if you remember where this team has been these last couple of years, the fact that they could be remotely frustrated coming away fourth, seventh, eighth in these races, a real testament to what they have built on track and off track so far. I think Pato Ward finished in sixth, a really tough day for him, really tough day for that team that we'll get into a little bit later. Kyle Kirkwood, again, kind of lurking around toward the top, but not much in the conversation. The fact that he's still seventh is, I would say, if you look at his results, a solid start to the year, an improvement upon last year. You've got Linus Lundqvist in eighth. Now at this point, we're getting a little bit far back from Colton and Will at the top. He's got 62 points to Colton's 101, but still solid start to the year for the full-time rookie. Scott McLaughlin jumped 20 spots in the standings after winning from pole, leading the most laps on Sunday. He sat 29th after his massive penalty from St. Pete, dating or linked to the Penske push-to-pass scandal that we'll touch on here in a second. He gains 54 points, now has 59 through 3 races, and is very much in this championship fight, which is pretty incredible to see given what he dealt with over the last week and the massive points haul that he lost from losing all of those 35 that he had at St. Pete. If I do the math in my head real quickly, he'd have 94. He'd be right up near the top had he not lost that. And then in 10th, as I mentioned, you have Santino Ferrucci, a couple solid finishes at or near the top 10 for this AJ Foyt Racing team. Perhaps we're seeing some of the fruits of their technical alliance with Team Penske. We'll see how that shakes up once we get to May, who gets the advantage of that, whether it's the team that finished third and had speed all month in AJ Foyt Racing last year, whether it was Team Penske, who didn't show a whole lot of speed, and then obviously we know what Joseph did over those closing laps. So again, really nice mix to this field through 3 races. Not a Penske Ganassi dominant group at the top that we would tend to expect even just a couple races in. Again, part of that dating back to how far back Joseph Newgarden fell, and the fact that Scott McLaughlin is even in the top 10 is a testament to how dominant he was on Sunday. So excited to see how this shakes out. I think we'll know a lot more about this field again, probably once we get past Road America. You'll have another street race in there at Detroit. We'll have our first oval of the year at the 500, and then another great battleground at Road America. That'll put us 7 races into a 17th race schedule. I think we'll have a good picture of who the 4, 5, maybe 6 title contenders are going to be once we get into August and September.
All right. We should also mention a mannequin fell on the near the track during the race. We don't want to not touch on
the fact that that is not like the leading story that we're talking about this week is, I think, just a testament to how incredibly weird this series has been since Wednesday. I mean, you had a good race coming off Long Beach that feels like should have gotten more play, and that seemed like that had happened a year ago. By the time we got to Wednesday and Thursday, it was long lost. But yes, that mannequin, I will admit, I've been covering the sport since the fall of 2019. I did not know of Georgina's existence. Maybe I should have. This was only, I think, my third race at Barber, so I hadn't made it ever around to that part of the track. Hadn't noticed that in TV broadcasts, but that is apparently a long-standing tradition at Barber Motorsports Park. Don't know if she's been there since the park opened in 2003 or even since IndyCar first went there in 2010, but is something that a lot of veteran drivers knew of, and when they drove by that, speeding by 180 miles an hour or so, a lot of those veteran guys knew exactly what they were seeing on the side of the road. I will admit, when I was watching the race broadcast, I don't know about you, Nat, I legitimately thought someone had fallen off that bridge, and I was very worried that I was going to have to cover a really gruesome story. Thankful that it was just a mannequin. But man, one of the weirder things it's a very IndyCar thing, because you have to know, I hate to make this comparison almost, but you just have to know that something like that's not going to happen in a Formula One race. There's no possible way that Formula One management and the FIA is going to allow a mannequin to be wired and tied to a bridge in a way that could remotely possibly fall anywhere on the track. And I think some folks had mentioned that she might have even, been hanging more towards the middle of the track in a couple of years past, rather than on the edge where she fell. And luckily only a hand was overlapping the track. Such a weird thing. I'm so glad that didn't fall on someone, because that could have spooked a driver and turned very quickly into a really bad accident. And that would have made this a lot more frustrating and a tough thing to cover, rather than something that we could laugh about and something that Scott McLaughlin could pose with after the race in the media center. But one of the weirder things that I have covered on this beat, and at the same time probably will have another wacky weird thing to throw on the list within a month or two.
Yeah, when I was watching it, I think you could tell it wasn't a person. I thought someone had thrown it onto the track, and I'm like, okay, now we got at least some mild controversy. It's bizarre to me that you would have it. Like, I'm all behind having a mannequin just hanging up there. I mean, it's the owner of the track, a guy who created the track. I'm forgetting his name now, but he's just a weird guy, and he likes
Mr. Barber. Yeah, he's a big. I mean, if you go to that track, there's some funky, I guess you would call it, artwork, sculpture pieces all around the track. It's a very eclectic place. Place that IndyCar fans I would encourage you to go to if you get an opportunity. It's a great place for fans to go and camp for a weekend. But it has a certain flavor to where if you've walked around the place for a weekend, you would not be surprised that there was a somewhat sketchy, rundown looking female mannequin in some tattered clothing hanging underneath a bridge that's remotely close to the racing line there.
Yeah, to me, the only thing is weird is why would you risk the mannequin falling onto the track? I think whoever moved it, which is probably, maybe that's why it fell. Maybe the mannequin was secure before that. But anyway, that's crazy. But let's get on to the Team Penske stuff. Give us a real quick. I'm sure most of the people watching, listening know the details, but give us a 30-second breakdown of what the issue was.
So again, a lot of this is all from Team Penske's side. They are the only real ones that claim to know how this all came to be, and their believability is something that is very much in question. in the paddock. I've got a story that I'm going to try to put together today that hopefully can get together to publish Friday that kind of goes into the questions that we still have around this. My thoughts, my takes, trying to be as reasonable and as unbiased as possible. But a quick breakdown: Team Penske claims that at the very start of the intensive hybrid testing that they began for Chevy as kind of the primary test team when hybrid testing really got ramped up in August, they changed some of the coding on their cars so that they could have unlimited use of push to pass in testing. They wouldn't have to bother IndyCar, wouldn't have to bother Chevy. That coding change then got essentially copy and pasted onto the driver setup profiles for Scott McLaughlin, Will Power, and Joseph Newgarden entering the 2024 season. Essentially, they forgot to change this coding back to what it should have been to start, and that allowed those three drivers in St. Pete to have access to push to pass during the race because there was push to pass allotment loaded onto the car's ECU. I'm not going to get too technical here, but basically the explanation from Tim Cindric, Team Penske president, was we didn't have access to this in practice or in qualifying because IndyCar does not load any push to pass time allotment onto the car's ECU. But when that was available, the coding that they had changed basically gave them unlimited use, not unlimited in the fact that they could use it for as much time as they wanted, but they could access their, I believe, 150 seconds during the race, during both starts and restarts, which has long been illegal under IndyCar's rules. Now, this allegedly went unnoticed by Team Penske and Chevy engineers. Joseph Newgarden, on the other hand, said that he and folks on the two car believed that IndyCar had changed its rules this offseason to reflect the rules that we had at Thermal Club for the $1 Million Challenge across the entire schedule, meaning that drivers did have access to push to pass on starts and restarts. So when he pressed it at St. Pete 3 times for a total of 9 seconds, twice on a lap 30 restart, once on a lap 72 restart, when his push to pass worked, he was not surprised and thought that that was just the case for the entire 27 car field. Now, fast forward to Long Beach. It is normal and a regular practice for teams to have access to push to pass during the Sunday morning warm-up ahead of a Sunday afternoon race. That is so that teams can just make sure it is working and run through their systems. That warm-up is really just kind of, again, as it sounds like, to make sure the car is working properly, test out a couple last-minute things, and get a sense of what your car is doing, a final window into what strategy you might use, how you're doing on certain tire compounds, etc. So in that Sunday morning warm-up, IndyCar officials in race control had not immediately turned push to pass on for the start of warm-up, and yet Team Penske had access to it anyways. It was immediately flagged on the timing and scoring data when 24 cars weren't using it, didn't have access to it, and yet Team Penske was using it as normal. They got called into the IndyCar race control transporter, asked about it. They claim that was the first time that they realized that this coding mistake had stayed in their cars since August. They took it out with the, under the observation of IndyCar officials. Their cars were compliant for Long Beach. We're fine moving forward from there. But that led then into another investigation, a lengthier investigation that unveiled that this problem had been around in St. Pete and that it gave them an unfair advantage. Led to the disqualification of Scott McLaughlin and Joseph Newgarden at St. Pete, a 10-point penalty for Will Power, who did not use this push-to-pass advantage when he shouldn't have been using it. And then we get into this weekend where we've got, one story from Team Penske president Tim Cindric that doesn't entirely jive with Joseph Newgarden, but isn't, completely in the face of it either. You've got an emotional press conference from Joseph Newgarden that feels highly believable until you talk to drivers and other team engineers and officials who say there's absolutely no way, understandably, from their position, that Team Penske would misunderstand the rules, that Team Penske engineers would not see this on data review of St. Pete. That what else was weird? I mean, just the fact that what would be seen as a massive rule change for the whole series wouldn't get discussed internally across all three cars, and then quickly realized that they misunderstood the rules. The fact that Joseph wouldn't have thought that this would be discussed during the drivers' meetings that they have every weekend to discuss general rules of the road and any intricacies to the track. It's just, there are a lot of parts of it that are not entirely believable if you talk to folks on both sides. Again, I got off the phone with Tim Cindric on Thursday as I was heading to hop on a flight to Atlanta and then drive to Barber, and felt like a lot of what he said made a lot of sense. But and I think if you listen to Joseph's in a vacuum and maybe weren't entirely familiar with some of the thoughts of other folks on other teams in the paddock, I think you could probably believe a lot of it too. And it's a tough situation. It's a black mark on the series. It's a black mark on its most famous, most successful team. It's a problem in that Roger Penske owns this team, owns this series, owns Ilmore, who makes engines for Chevy. Again, there are some folks that I think are dead set that there's no way Roger Penske could know about this. I consider myself in the camp that, with enough time that I've spent around Roger, though I know he is very particular about every part of his far-reaching business, do I think that Roger Penske is up to date on all of the coding intricacies in all of his cars? No, I don't. Is it tough to believe that no one between March and late April thought that something was a foul in their cars, or that they misunderstood something, or they were taking an unfair advantage of something? Yes, it's tough to believe. But when it comes down to all of this, the way I have come out of it, and I think it's kind of similar in a way to NBC, IndyCar booth member Townsend Bell, is that we don't have hard facts to be able to prove Team Penske and Joseph and Tim guilty. You know, if you took this to a court of law, now we might get some more information. You'd have some people testifying and whatnot. But I don't know that you could prove without a shadow of a doubt that this team knowingly did something wrong. It's a tough storyline to parse through when you have folks on both sides who are so adamant that they are the ones that know what's going on and who's right and who's wrong and what's possible and what's impossible. I think it's something that at this point, less than a week, or I guess it's now been just barely over a week since we initially heard about this, I don't know that anyone's changing anyone's mind at this point. I don't know that, by Friday or Saturday, anyone was changing anyone's mind. So it's something that we'll have to move forward from. It's called Team Penske's ethics into question a little bit, depending on what team you are a fan of or a member of. And it's something that Team Penske is going to have to answer for a while moving forward. Joseph Newgarden was already not maybe super close with a lot of drivers in the paddock, which is a stark difference from where he was certainly before his tenure at Team Penske, and I would probably say even before a couple of years ago. And I think he's going to have some work to do to, whether it's building any friendships back or building back a level of trust or building back up his reputation among drivers in the paddock. I mean, there's an excellent photo that I think someone from IndyCar's photo team took before the race, when you've got drivers that are standing around a stage getting ready for driver introductions. And there's a crowd of folks. I think it was like Santino Ferrucci and Will Power and Colton Herta, maybe a handful of other drivers. And you've got this stark difference of Joseph Newgarden standing maybe 3 feet away, sunglasses on, leaning up against a wall, staring down at his phone, completely in his own other world. It's a very interesting time to be in Team Penske's orbit. Very interesting time for this series, and a tough thing that for everyone to move on from. We've got so much to talk about and get excited about and celebrate with the month of May now officially here, but this is not going to be a topic of conversation that it's just going to get swept under the rug here in a day or two.
I think there's maybe 4 sort of points that stick out to me, so we'll tick them off here as quick as possible. I don't think this was a conspiracy from the top, because by all accounts, this was going to be discovered. I mean, you couldn't hide this forever.
Mm-hmm.
So this is either an honest mistake, which is what I think Tim Cindric has said, or somebody somewhere down the lines realized, again, I'm not reporting anything here. Obviously, I'm simply speculating. Somebody realized down, lower on the ladder that this was there and said, hey, let's just pretend we don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thought on that on that topic?
It's definitely possible. Again, I mean, Tim Cindric made the point to me on Thursday morning when I spoke to him again, we're taping this a week later, so we're talking Thursday between Long Beach and Barber. But he said, and it was, again, very convincing and a great point, if we were going to cheat, do you think we're stupid enough to do it in a way that is so, like, obviously it wasn't caught at St. Pete. And I had a team owner from a competitor in the paddock say that they went back and they rewatched essentially the data flow through their timing and scoring monitor, their telemetry that shows the entire field. And you can see on there those restarts where Joseph Newgarden hit the button, Scott McLaughlin too, but Joseph was a lot more egregious in this. You can see where after every lap, teams don't have live access to how much push to pass folks are using. And so they did a couple years ago before my time, and this was taken away so that drivers couldn't be super reactive to someone behind them hitting the button so that they just automatically hit the button. Now you can watch some live onboards if you're a team that's wanting to do that and focusing on a couple guys that you're around on track. But essentially this bank of 150 seconds that these drivers have at their disposal during races, that how much they have used or how much they have left just gets updated at the end of every single lap. And so someone mentioned to me that if you go back and watch it at the right time, you can see when Joseph's decreases by a couple seconds on after lap 30 and after lap 72, and no one else is in the field does. And that, if someone happened to be watching that, you would have immediately you would have realized this was just a restart. He shouldn't have been able to use it. And you would have noticed that he was the only one to use it. And that's incredibly rare. But when you're using it on a restart, you're not using it at the start of the race where everyone should, still have 150 or 200 seconds going into lap 2. That would be a lot more obvious. But when you've got everyone's jumbled up, if you're not looking the moment that Joseph's changes and you haven't been following to know what he had the lap before going into that restart, it's not something that would stand out. So it's really tough not to believe Tim in this instance that, hey, if we were going to cheat, there are a heck of a lot more discrete ways to do this. This was something that was going to get found at some point. And this is something that they were going to roll into the Long Beach race with. And had it not been caught during the Long Beach warm-up, I don't think there's any reason to think why in this tight turnaround going into Barber, depending on how Joseph or Will or Scott used it in the race at Long Beach, that this wouldn't have still been in the cars for Barber. And now you've got 3 races. And it's a lot to risk for a team that I would imagine would understand what these penalties were going to be. I don't think anyone was very surprised that Scott and Joseph were disqualified from St. Pete and lost all their points. So you're saying, if you're on the anti-Team Penske side, you're saying that they were willing to get a couple seconds each race of 50 horsepower advantage where no one else in the field had it, at the risk of every single road and street course race point that they earned outside of a pole until this was caught. And that's just the math on that doesn't balance out. If you just look at this purely from an objective standpoint, you kind of take all of the emotion out of it and your position on who you like or who you don't like or who you believe historically in all of this. Now, at the same time, from talking to some engineers and some team officials, folks absolutely do not believe that that data got looked over as thoroughly as it should be, especially if you work for Team Penske and you are a championship level competitor, that something would not look abnormal in that data, whether you're looking at it just from the team or from all the Team Chevy cars. So that's still something that I also feel like the teams who are saying, almost yelling this in private, do I think all of them are being outlandish and just totally biased? No, I don't. So it's a tough thing to know who to believe. Someone here is right, someone here is wrong, and they both are incredibly believable. And it's tough to know how to move forward from this.
Point number 2, was the punishment harsh enough?
I will go back, and I've said this, I've kind of hinted at it in at least one of the stories that I wrote. I don't think Will Power as a driver got off too light. I think Will Power's number 12 Team Penske Verizon Chevy should have been disqualified from an entrant points standpoint, just as Joseph's number 2 car and Scott's number 3 car were, because his car from a technical standpoint was just as illegal as their 2 cars were. You have, for those unfamiliar, you have a driver's points championship that, if I'm correct on this, I believe the Astor Cup at the end of the season is awarded to the drivers' championship. The leaders circle group and who joins that, and payouts that are related to that, I believe, are related to the entrance points championship. I don't know if there are any other things that really matters or goes into. And no, do I think Will would have finished out, is going to finish outside the top 22 this year had he been disqualified from St. Pete? No, I don't. So I don't know how much that would have changed things for Team Penske if you allow Will to have all of his driver's points and you disqualify him from an entrance points standpoint. So maybe that doesn't make sense either, but I don't know. I think you could argue that the fines could be more, but again, as much as Mark Miles, Penske Entertainment president and CEO, tried to assert when we talked to he and Jay Fry on Friday at Barber, tried to assert that that these companies are wholly separate, Team Penske and Penske Entertainment. Roger Penske still owns them both. Penske Corp still owns them both. In reality, you're taking money from one bank account and you're moving it to another bank account. To say that that you're moving it from checking to savings is maybe a little bit too simplistic, but Team Penske is not going to not be able to do things this season because they lost $75,000 that now is still in Roger Penske's ownership. It's a tough thing to figure out what would have been better. I think you could argue they could have been a little bit stricter. I know there are some people out there saying that they should have been suspended for multiple races. I don't know that we need to go quite that far. I know in NASCAR, whenever you have something that's anything more than a minor technical infraction, you've got team members who are suspended, and I think you could have absolutely done something to that effect. I don't know if the rule book allows for that. I know oftentimes you'll see, say, if a tire is not put on properly in NASCAR and then a car's tire falls off on track during green flag racing, you'll have that tire changer or that crew chief suspended for the next race or the next couple races. I think we could have absolutely seen something like that would have been reasonable. It's, I guess, the person that you would have looked to for something like that would have maybe been team president Tim Cindric or managing director Ron Rzuski. Again, both of those men claim to have not known anything was awry until Long Beach. They weren't purposefully doing something, but it was also kind of their responsibility to, as the overarching figureheads on this team, just like when a college coach is suspended or fined or penalized for things that are happening to his team off the court, whether it be recruiting violations or team misconduct. At some point, if you're in charge, you got to be in charge and you have to take responsibility when things like this happen. So I think that might have been the best way to send a message that this was something that wasn't going to be tolerated on top of the disqualifications. Again, I think you could have been a little stricter on wills, but I don't know how much of an impact that would have really had, unless you want to completely disqualify Will, which I guess I probably could have gotten behind, but then that's tough to reason that Joseph, who used 9 seconds of push to pass, essentially had the same penalty that Will did when he didn't use it at all. That's tough too.
The third and fourth points are somewhat related, but I'll try it. I'll hit. We'll get to Joseph last, but to me, Penske. Again, you've touched on this, so I don't think we need to go too deep into it. I can't believe Roger Penske knew about this. I can't believe he wanted this. At the same time, you are not generally, you are not successful in sports at the level Roger Penske is unless you're willing to go right up to the rules. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, you say, here's the rule, and then you, as a team, an individual athlete, I don't care the sport, I don't care what it is, if you haven't been around athletes at this level, you might not realize it, but you cannot believe how competitive most of these people are. And so that's what they're going to do. Again, did that attitude permeate the lower levels of the team where they said, hey, I can see that. But as you noted earlier, the stakes for Roger Penske here are so high. I just can't believe he had anything to do with this and everything he's done since this has come out. I mean, they went back and said, did this happen in 2023? And so, I mean, I just can't believe, again, Penske's in charge. Whatever happens with his team is in some degree his fault, as you noted, his responsibility. But I think to put too much on him in terms of this being intentional doesn't strike me as accurate or right or realistic, I guess.
No, and I have only been covering the sport since, minus 5 or 6 weeks of my time covering the sport for the IndyStar has virtually all been with Roger Penske owning the series and therefore taking a step back from this race team. Now, Roger still, he's not wholly disconnected. He addressed the team on Saturday and was talking to them as the team owner, not the series owner, rallying folks, trying to get folks' spirits up and to basically saying, in a way, I wasn't there for the conversation, but the way it was described to me, it was, a rallying cry of, I believe you guys. I know you guys didn't do anything wrong, purposefully at least. And so there's not, a complete brick wall built between him and that entity. But do I think Roger Penske knows as much of what is going on in his race team now as he did in 2018 or 2019? No, I do not. Do I think that maybe there's even a chance that some of that has changed over the last couple of years? I think that's entirely possible. Roger, the sport of IndyCar and IMS has a heck of a lot going on behind the scenes between TV contract negotiations, this charter system. IMS is potentially looking at as close to a sellout, if not a sellout, as we've had since the 100th running in 2016. So many more things from a marketing growth standpoint that this series is battling that they are facing from complaints and frustrations from other team owners in the sport about the way in which and the speed in which this series is going about trying to tackle marketing and growth, that I can't wrap my head around him also having time to know what's going on from an engineering standpoint with this team. And I do not also believe that Roger would have been willing to risk, again, something that would have been so easy to catch eventually, and something that I think in the grand scheme of things wouldn't have been this just massive overarching benefit. I can't get myself to think that Roger Penske would have been willing to risk this from a reputational standpoint, because there are a lot of folks now that believe that Roger Penske knew. You have some team owners who are privately asserting that. You have some journalists who are privately asserting that as well. Is reflective, I think, in the way in which some folks have gone about reporting on this. And talking to Roger as I have over these last couple of years, I know how much owning this series and stewarding IndyCar and IMS and leaving it in a better place than when he received it is to him. And I just can't understand why he would know about this and be willing to sweep it under the rug or turn a blind eye to it. And again, the only way that would be possible is if this was a widespread known thing inside Team Penske, and we just don't know who knew or didn't know about this. But I think the Roger Penske that was willing to go to the ends of the earth in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s to find every single loophole from a race team advantage standpoint is just not the same Roger Penske that we have nowadays, who, yes, does own an IndyCar team, but also I think higher priority probably in some ways is the betterment of IndyCar and IMS, because that needs his hands-on time and care and energy more than his IndyCar team. This team, again, both sides are run from a day-to-day perspective by folks he knows well and trusts and has for some time, between Tim Cindric on Team Penske, Bud Danker, Jonathan Gibson, Mark Miles, and other folks at Penske Entertainment. But I just think Roger is using so much more of his time and energy on Penske Entertainment than he is Team Penske. And of course, he's got all of these other businesses across Penske Corp, where he's flying all over the world. He's on phone calls every hour of the day. I don't, as much as we talk about Roger Penske only sleeping a couple of hours a day, I just don't know that there's enough bandwidth for him to know what's going on with his race team anymore from an engineering standpoint.
I guess I would say maybe he should go to his people and say, let's be more careful, or we can't have this attitude, and that, or then maybe there should be some check from him on his people. But
yeah,
let's get to Joseph. The thing you and I have talked offline about this, his press conference, in terms of throwing himself on the mercy of public opinion, I think it was textbook to 95%. I mean, he did everything that you could want him to do, but then he says, I thought the rule had changed. And I just have again, I don't know anything. We're not reporting anything. I have a really hard time believing he didn't know that he thought the rule changed when there's been you touched on this already, but there's very little talk. There's been no talk about it because it didn't exist. And to not think that there would be more, I don't understand why he wouldn't have just said, I realized that I had an advantage. I took it. I should not have. I am 100% guilty, because that's what he did on everything else. I just don't buy that. Where are you coming in on that?
I think it's the least believable part of all of this. Truly, from an objective standpoint, if you're going to tell me, and what makes it even worse too is that Joseph didn't just say, I misunderstood the rules. He implicated his entire two-car team, which of course includes Tim Cindric, who is the number 2 car strategist, who stands on his timing stand. Again, Tim's also probably monitoring his other 2 cars. I don't know that Tim's paying so close attention to notice when Joseph's push to pass number goes down on a restart necessarily. I haven't been there. I can't speak for everything that goes into Tim's job, but we've seen some footage of Tim on 100 Days at Indy, I think this year specifically on episode 1, and maybe even some last year. Like, he's in these strategy meetings. They're talking about all these minute details, and to think that the number 2 car team had a wholly different understanding of the rules compared to the other 2 cars, that something like that Joseph both thought could change, and then not have like big team meetings or reminders about it from a team wide standpoint. It's just, I can't wrap my head around it. And at the same time, and I think I've both said this to you and others as well. They had 48 hours, or more. 48 hours from when the news came out on Wednesday until this press conference. They had another day or even 2 days when they started to realize that this was a problem. There are enough smart people at Team Penske on their, team official side, on their PR side, their comm side, that I'm sure was bounced around enough between enough people to realize how unbelievable that story was going to be. And so I keep coming back to the fact that if you went out there and whatever the truth was, this was not going to be something that was going to win people over. It was going to be something that could be poked through immediately. And so I keep coming back to this story is stranger than fiction. Why else would you say this unless it was true? It's more about I can't figure out how Joseph got to this point and how other folks on his team got to this point. The only way I've been able to maybe tell myself, and then this almost makes the team look worse, is that this was a purposeful thing from the engineering side, and someone planted this idea in Joseph's head and said, we need to convince Joseph that this was real, or, that this rule has changed. And so he's pushing the button all the time, so that this thing that we put into the coding, we can actually get an advantage of. Joseph, as Tim told me a week ago, is a frequent presser of the button, even when it's not working. He's joked about it with people in the past, other drivers, saying that there are some drivers that frankly just push it on every start and restart of just about every single one, hoping that it happens to work. And so the only thing I can wrap my brain around is that this was like a known thing that folks either within Chevy or Team Penske were trying to do purposefully. And so someone almost convinced Joseph, I guess you would say, that this was a change so that they could fully take advantage of it. And again, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm not saying I think that's the truth. I have had no one tell me that, but your mind goes to weird places as you're trying to digest all of this and figure how it could possibly all make sense. And again, I don't believe that, but at the same time, I think first of all, I think there's some folks out there that think Joseph getting in a press conference for 25 minutes was the last thing he should have been doing. I think if you want to make this go away, you deny, no comment, we're moving on this until you're blue in the face. And people are going to have questions, but they're not going to maybe outright think you're lying, or at least be able to prove and say why they think you're lying. This was a way that folks could easily poke gaping holes in Joseph's story and Team Penske's story. But I think Joseph, he told us he didn't want to put out a statement. He wanted to be real. He wanted to be raw. He wanted to build some sort of a connection. And now you got folks that either believe him in some part, very few that believe him wholly, and some folks that think he was just putting on a show. I don't still entirely know where I fall in all of that. But as you said, that Joseph Newgarden, someone who is so meticulous about every single thing that he does, that he went through the process of unfollowing every single Twitter or X account that he follows so that he wouldn't have any distractions from a social media standpoint. I just don't know how that guy didn't know one of the most basic rules in IndyCar hadn't changed.
And again, this goes back to what I said. You just don't underappreciate how competitive these guys, and pushing the push to pass when it doesn't work, on the odd chance that it might. And it's not just Joseph Newgarden, from what I understand, that does this. It's other drivers. Correct. That's the type of personalities. You don't get to be an IndyCar champion, or I shouldn't say it's there's a lot of people who are going to be champions who that's their attitude. And again, I don't want to get into a debate of steroids in baseball versus this or whatever, but why do you think people were taking steroids? Because it was an advantage, and they take every advantage that they can, because you don't get to that level unless you're willing to do that. I can easily see Scott McLaughlin pushing the button, realizing it worked, and saying, I know I'm not supposed to do that, and didn't do it again. Will Power, obviously, is someone who doesn't push the button, because why would you? It doesn't work. But again, do I 100% believe that it's possible a super competitive athlete would find out that they had an advantage that maybe they weren't supposed to have and take advantage of it, even though like in a sober moment they would realize that was wrong, which I think is what we saw. I mean, I don't doubt Newgarden's sincerity in what he said, in terms of how badly he feels and how much he understands how he screwed up. But that's just, I do think he had to talk. I mean, I don't think this is going to ever go away unless he did talk. Maybe he shouldn't have waited 2 days to do it. Maybe he should have got out there quicker. But again, I just don't understand why he said everything he said and then said I thought the rule had changed, because I just don't. And like you say, is that such a stupid thing to say that you almost have to believe him? I don't buy that, but I understand where you're coming from. So
yeah.
Let's wrap up here. David Malukas, no longer a driver for Arrow McLaren. This seems like if assuming everything we've been told is accurate, we have no reason to think it isn't. He went on a normal bike ride, made a mistake, severely injured his wrist, and now he's out of a car, out of an opportunity that is a fantastic opportunity and could have long-lasting ramifications for him. Again, just sort of take us through where we're at with the Malukas and Arrow McLaren story.
Yeah, it's a real shame. As I wrote in a piece that published this morning, as much of a shame as it is, I could see this coming for a couple months now. There was chatter in St. Pete from multiple folks that I trust in these types of situations, disconnected from the parties, but who have been in and around IndyCar long enough and have done contracts and have been involved in both sides of this to know that David was on a clock and it was ticking, and it was at some point, and I think unless the recovery went according to plan and he was out for 6 weeks and he was in by Long Beach or Barber at the latest, this was going to become a problem where it was probably going to, unfortunately, end this way. From what I understand, he had a clause in his contract, and I don't know how common this. I believe something like this clause is probably somewhat normal, and I don't know how the length compares to other drivers, but it essentially said if you miss, whether it was 4 straight races or just 4 races total, I don't know, but essentially the gist of it was, if you miss 4 races, we have the option to terminate your deal on the spot. And so Malukas missed. Yes, it was just the 3rd points paying race, but it was an event. The Thermal Club was an event that they had sponsors on the car who paid for the time for. It was broadcast on national TV. And I think for all intents and purposes, outside of points, this was an event that Arrow McLaren prepared for. And had sponsors relying on it for, just as it would for every other race or event weekend on the calendar. And so this was the 4th one that Malukas had missed. And as it was explained to me, Arrow McLaren felt as if they did not sever ties with him after this weekend, holding on to him and him missing a 5th event or a 6th event, 5th being the Sancio Grand Prix on the IMS road course in a couple weekends, the 6th being the 500 in 3 weeks or so, that would almost look like a tacit admission or promise that they were going to hold the seat open for David and indefinitely until he returned. And so if they didn't get rid of him now, and say they do it after the 500, if he's or the moment that car is qualified, or the moment he maybe can't do Detroit either, which is the weekend after the 500, you're starting to get into a point where they felt like they were exposing themselves from a legal standpoint, that David could sue, saying, you kept me on, you promised that you would give me an opportunity after my wrist healed to be able to get in the car. You took away, went back on that promise, and I'm going to sue you. And the last thing Arrow McLaren needs is another legal drama to involve itself in. It's got enough going on behind the scenes with David and his injury and filling that hole and dealing with what I can only imagine as a frustrated sponsor in NTT Data, who's on the side pod of that number 6 car for a lot of this season, who initially came because they thought that Alex Palou was going to be in that ride. NTT Data left Chip Ganassi Racing after that contract expired with that team at the end of 2022. They could have either re-upped for what I would assume would have been multiple years at Ganassi. They probably made that decision around the time that they thought that Alex Palou was going to be driving for Arrow McLaren in 2023. We all know what happened there, and they still made that decision under the impression, correctly, that Alex had signed a contract and was going to be there in 2024, which he was set to be until last August when he changed his mind and turned his back on Zach Brown and McLaren and Arrow McLaren, even though he had signed a wholly legal deal and decided to sign a new 3-year extension with Chip Ganassi Racing instead. So you have a big sponsor on the team of NTT Data that was put in this weird spot where, now Arrow McLaren has to put a driver in a car that's maybe not someone that would typically fit their standards. I understood that they look at Callum Ilott. Callum Ilott was tied down with the team option by JHR. So eventually they land on David Malukas, who had a couple podiums in 2 seasons with Dale Coyne Racing. Other than that, not super stellar results. How much of that was on David? How much of that was on the team? You could have endless arguments over. I think especially last season, the team was really struggling, and it's very easy to see that. So they landed on David, somewhat unproven, a guy who had showed some speed, and you could totally understand in a good car could finish in the top 10 in points, maybe have, a win here, there, a handful of podiums, a consistent season that could easily run alongside the 10th place that Alexander Rossi put together last year. And then he gets injured. Yes, he says he was training for the season, but I think something like this is very different than if he had injured his wrist while he was in a test or while he was in a race. I think it's a lot tougher to cut him loose if he was racing for you, especially if the mistake that caused a crash was not under his control, but they got caught in this position where they've got a sponsor that they need to keep happy. They've got a sporting director in Tony Kanaan that was brought in at the end of last year to essentially train any young drivers, get them up to speed like Malukas, while also being able to help Pato O'Ward and Alexander Rossi and just have another body, another voice in there who's been involved in the sport for decades, who can help them figure out, any small thing that they're dealing with on track, off the track, speak, another voice in those engineering meetings to kind of help this team find its rhythm, find its way, and get to championship contention on a consistent basis. So when Tony is now having to, connect David with, physical therapists, or drive to him to doctor's appointments, or drop off a sim rig for David to hopefully use soon to be able to get, as he's working his way back. It's sucking a lot of time and energy and planning. And in some cases, probably morale out of this team that has had a rocky start to the year. And so they had the legal route to be able to do this. They had a driver that had not built up enough cachet in on-track performances to where the team felt like they couldn't afford to lose him. And they felt like there are enough folks out there, both short-term to fill out the rest of the calendar this year and long-term, looking towards 2025, that could be the type of talent that David might be. We still don't entirely know what he is, that could fill that role. And it's sad. It's unfortunate. It's going to be a tough thing for David to recover from mentally, as well as on track. I do think he'll have another ride. His team, or his family, owns HMD Motorsports and HMD Trucking that I think could certainly factor into help getting him a ride at some point down the road in a couple different opportunities. Too early to know where. But I just think, as I wrote in a piece that published this morning on IndyStar.com, this is essentially just another business decision, a tough one, but a business decision that a team in Arrow McLaren's position that is trying to claw its way to the top of the sport has to make. They can't afford distractions. They can't afford wasting time and energy on a driver project that they think, that they don't know when it's going to be on the track, that they don't know how is going to help them. And at this point of the season has taken a lot of time and effort away from what they were trying to do with other folks on their team with Pato and Rossi. So a tough look, but I think a decision that this team is comfortable, whether it be Gavin Ward or Zach Brown, et cetera, I think realized that they had to make for the betterment of this team. I know you don't want to necessarily put an entire team ahead of one member of your team. And if this had happened to Alexander Rossi or Pato O'Ward, I do think this is different. No, you don't want to make this seem or look like David was the sacrificial lamb that is going to fix all of this team's struggles and its rocky start to the year. But at the same time, I think they felt like they were in a position where they couldn't continue to prioritize David's uncertain timetable for a return at the expense of the success of this team when there's so much on the table from a money, financial, sponsor, results standpoint that this team has its goals and its eyes set on.
All right, well, that'll wrap up our IndyCar Weekly episode. We appreciate you watching and or listening. Come back to IndyStar.com. It's May. We'll have everything you need to know about the Indy 500 and everything else in IndyCar. Thank you.
Yep, we'll have a quick thing to note. Stefan Wilson, who I know a lot of you probably have enjoyed listening to as a co-host, just really
More
busy.
than me?
We'll see what the downloads reflect. We'll maybe have a little bit of competition there. Stefan had a crazy busy weekend, both for the Barber weekend and this upcoming, doing some different coaching gigs from a driver perspective, and so was unable to join. Definitely expect him and excited to have him back on the pod several times more this May, but appreciate Nat for stepping in. We will have our next episode recapping the Sancio Grand Prix, and I think Stefan and I believe, are planning on taping that the Monday before Indy 500 practice starts. So we'll recap that race. We'll get you all ready for the month of May on the IMS Oval. But just wanted to let folks know why Stefan wasn't here. Look forward to having him back. Thanks again for those of you who have listened. Hope you subscribe, give us reviews, downloads, all that stuff. It really helps, and we're excited to give you guys lots of video content, podcast content, written stories as we get into the heart of May here in Indianapolis.
Thank you.